I want to go ahead and skip ahead and start talking about the answers. Even if you haven't written anything, you should have gotten far enough to be able to know what your answer would be. Part A just asks for the null and alternative hypothesis. It does not ask you for a population specifically in this, but what would the population be? Students attending this specific university. Again, asking outside of the question a little bit because it's a lead into today. Did we take one sample and ask them 2 questions, or did we take 2 separate samples and ask them each 1 question? Did we take 1 sample and ask 2 questions, or did we take 2 separate samples and ask each of them 1 question? 1 sample. So we took the 200 people. For each person, we asked them the average time spent on part-time jobs and also their perception of work on academic achievement, which makes it chi-square test of independence that we did yesterday. So answering actually part A, what is one of our variables? Average time spent on part-time jobs, which is this way. What's our other variable? In general, what word? So it's this part right here. So those are our 2 variables. This one does get a little bit wordy, wordier than the ones we did yesterday. Technically, this would be effective part-time, or our null hypothesis would be effective part-time work on academic achievement and average number of hours per week students work are what? How do I end my null hypothesis? Or what? Are independent. My alternative hypothesis would say the exact same thing, but would instead end with are not independent. And like I said yesterday, it doesn't really matter if I say average time spent on part-time jobs first or second. We're just talking about whether they're independent or not. Part B is asking if the conditions for inference are met. You shouldn't be confused with the wording of that one. Just did we meet the conditions? So what's our first condition? Random. What did this problem say? It literally specifically said what? It said it was SRS, said it was a simple random sample. So stated simple random sample, which we would put in parentheses, random selection. What's our next condition? Large sample size. Now this overall should be a very easy question. The reason I'm choosing to do it is because it looks funny. And it was an old AP exam question, so I want to make sure that y'all can follow the way they wrote it. It does say expected counts are printed below observed counts. So say they made one chart where they went ahead and did everything for you. You didn't have to do anything. So calculator-wise, it did the chi-square, it did the expected. So literally, you should not have had to pick up your calculator at all for this problem. I want you to realize that. Now, if you did, you're going to get the same number, so it wouldn't have mattered. But you didn't have to. So for large sample size, we need to write what? All expected counts are greater than or equal to 5. I would have written something like printed in the chart below observed counts or something to show that, like, hey, I knew where they were, or draw an arrow to them or something, because you're not going to want to rewrite that whole chart. What's our last condition? Independent, which is 10% condition. 200 times 10 is 2,000. And we would say there are at least 2,000 students attending this university.
It states that
it states that there's 20,000, and some people are going to specifically reference that, and that's why it gave it to you initially in the first place anyway. Part C, given the results. So it already did everything for us. It found the chi-square. It found degrees of freedom. It found the p-value. Is that a high or low p-value? Low, which means we're going to what? Reject. So we'd reject the null hypothesis since the p-value is less than alpha. And then we would go on to say there is enough convincing evidence that, and we would basically state the alternative hypothesis. The effect of part-time work on academic achievement and average number of hours spent per week. I missed a word when I wrote this out. Per week for students' work are not independent. How would I end that? For students at this particular university, make sure that you leave your population in there, and some people are going to have forgotten that at this point because we haven't practiced it much. So your conclude should end with for population. And then part D is just something that we've talked about more this year than I ever have. We did choose to reject. So which one, type 1 or type 2, actually does reject? Let me draw it out. It's always easier to see it. So null hypothesis true, null hypothesis false. So in this one, the null hypothesis was true, but we what? But we rejected. Here it was false, but we failed to reject. This is type 2. This is type 1. We did reject. So which is the only one that we could have made? Type 1. We could go on and talk about, in the context of the problem, would be the two variables actually were independent, but we incorrectly said that they were not. You could get more context about that, but that's not my main concern for today. Questions with anything on this worksheet? So because this is from an old AP exam, there's a chance that you could see it written like this. So I want to make sure everybody realizes that they can see expected and observed counts written on one chart together. Now, I wouldn't suggest doing it that way because I think it's confusing, but you might be given a problem with all the answers on there already done this way.